Hey there everyone. So today I have a work I'm very excited to start going over, which is Gilles Deleuze's Difference and Repetition. In this work, Deleuze is really fighting against representation as the precondition for our talks about identity. He wants to wrest from the notion of representation this sense of what the world actually is. And in doing this, he's trying to ground difference as primary rather than as a sort of negation which goes against forms as they exist in the Platonic sense. And in this part, I'd like to look at the preface to the English edition as well as the just normal preface and the introduction. In the preface to the English edition, he states that we tend to subordinate difference to identity in order to think it. And really, this is a reference to Plato. So in Platonism, if you have a word to talk about something, like the word blue, for example, Plato would say, well, how do we have a conception of what that word means such that we can apply the same word to different things? How is it that somehow blueness stands above things and can shift between different objects and be applied to different objects and still have some coherence across those different instantiations? And Plato would say, well, it's because there is a form of blueness which is blueness as such. It has no predicates. It is simply pure blueness as an ideal category, which is the referent whenever we use the word blue, such that you and I are thinking of the same thing when we think about blue. Now, Deleuze sees this as problematic because it takes difference to be a question only of negation or lack, and thus he really sees this as a fundamental ontological mistake because it doesn't actually describe how the world works. Deleuze is trying to point out that in fact difference is primary, and this is something that they make abundantly clear both in anti-oedipus when they're focused mostly on the unconscious, trying to show that desiring production is primary instead of the Oedipus complex, and therefore deviation from the Oedipus complex as lack and neuroses. And in 1,000 Plateaus, where they try to show that creativity and chaos and the refrain, for example, and the war machine too, are the fundamental forces and modes of function of the world, rather than the solid notions of form that come after them that we tend to think are what grounds those various notions of creativity. So in this project, Deleuze is trying to find a way to talk about difference in which we don't subordinate it to an identity from which one cannot deviate. And in order to do this, he has to get out of the image of thought, the traditional image of thought that assumes, for example, that thought possesses a good nature, as he says, that we want the true, that we take as our model the process of recognition. And instead, he wants to find a way to talk about things which confronts things not as just reducing to representations, not as reducing to some image, but rather actually encountering reality and getting that breath of fresh air that he and Guattari talk about in Anti-Oedipus. He speaks of this as a liberation of thought from those images which imprison it. This is what I had already sought to discover in Proust. Here, however, in Difference and Repetition, this search is autonomous, and it becomes the condition for the discovery of these two concepts. So, liberation of thought from images, a form of existence that doesn't reduce to representation, in fact, is actually an autonomous condition, which is the precondition for the establishment of these notions of difference and repetition. Opening into the regular preface, Deleuze is trying to start out by making a fundamental terminological distinction that repetition is not the same as generality, which is to say that the idea that something repeats itself does not mean that it reduces to some general form. What Deleuze wants to try to point out is that, in fact, repetition has built into itself a notion of difference, such that each time something is repeated, even if it is repeated the same way, for example, if I say the same words over and over, each time the word is still different, even though it is the same word. Because if you think about, for example, if I say dog, 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 and I keep saying dog over and over again, well, first off, the word starts to appear different in your mind. I'm also using it at different moments in time, such that I can say that I've said dog X amount of times, and I can differentiate one from the other. So within this notion of sameness, there is actually a fundamental presupposition of difference, which defines them. And Deleuze sees this as really the breaking point for getting out of Hegelianism. He says that all these signs may be attributed to a generalized anti-Hegelianism, that difference and repetition have taken the place of the identical and the negative, of identity and contradiction. And this is important to mention, is if you want to read this work, do not, and I'm not just saying this to gatekeep, this is like real honest. If you haven't read Hegel, at the very least, if you haven't read The Phenomenology of Spirit, do not read this book. I promise it's not going to make any sense, but I'll give you a little primer, and I've done other lectures on my channel if you're curious to kind of get some of the background. But for Hegel, for example, you have concepts which get sublated by running into a contradiction, basically. And this sublation, there's of course self-sublation in Hegel, that concepts in and of themselves will require an opposite, in fact, or something different, an other, in order to exist, viz. The master-slave dialectic. But for Hegel, these moments of difference were the transition from one concept to the next, where concepts were the stable foundation, and difference was merely a blip when a concept saw its contradiction. So you have something that has an identity. A common example I like to use is a cup, and a cup has an amount of, in this case, I have almond milk in my cup. It's got an amount of almond milk in it right now. And when I drink it, that cup will now have less almond milk in it. So one of the fundamental properties that makes that cup what it is, namely the fact that it is holding something, has changed insofar as that something has changed in quantity, right? There's less, I guess there's more open volume in the cup now, and there's less occupied volume in the cup now. So from point A to point B, a change has occurred. And Hegel wants to say that, in fact, these changes can be subsumed and sublated to our notions of identity, such that something can undergo changes and we can still talk about it as that same thing by looking at the way that it runs up against its contradictions and sublates them and synthesizes them into some new form of identity, namely the cup at point B, which is a conglomeration of cup point A and cup point B, because cup A once existed and I knew about it. And my very knowledge of the cup before I drank anything from it is a precondition for talking about the cup at point B, because of course it presupposes my knowledge of cup A, cup at point A, in order for cup B to mean exactly what it means to me. So difference in this case is merely that shift between one moment and the other, and it's something negative, something which negates the previous identity, cup at point A, and makes it no longer true, or no longer true in the capital T truth sense. It is merely a moment of truth, as Hegel would put it. And for Deleuze, this notion of difference is not benign, and it's not true either. It's not ontologically sound. And when we think about the fact that Deleuze, especially in his work with Guattari, really emphasizes the political kind of results of these different ideas, and their ideas too, they link to various political things in like the War Machine and the Apparatus of Capture chapter and A Thousand Plateaus. But the political notions of difference as a lack, when that manifests in the world, it's going to manifest as fascism. It's going to manifest where we have some ideal, like the ideal Aryan race, and difference from that needs to be exterminated or needs to be dealt with or needs to be, corrected in the notion of like prisons today, where difference is essentially some kind of lack which always exists, which needs to be acted upon and via discipline needs to essentially be changed in order to reach our ideal society. Deleuze sees this as problematic. And Deleuze wants to try to find a notion of pure difference. He says, for difference implies a negative and allows itself to lead to contradiction only to the extent that its subordination to the identical is maintained. The primacy of identity, however conceived, defines the world of representation. But modern thought is born of the failure of representation, of the loss of identities, and of the discovery of all the forces that act under the representation of the identical. The modern world is one of simulacra. Man did not survive God, nor did the identity of the subject survive that of substance. All identities are only simulated, produced as an optical effect by the more profound game of difference and repetition. We propose to think difference in itself, independently of the forms of representation which subdue it to the same, and the relation of different to different independently of those forms which make them pass through the negative. And this is something really interesting because difference is taking on a positive aspect here. Difference is in fact the fondement that is constructing our ideas of identity. And this is what he's trying to point out, that one of the triumphs of modern philosophy, think for example with Nietzsche's genealogy of morals or the death of God, that we're finding the stuff that undergirds our ideal notions that have just kind of sailed through society and through thought, in philosophy especially, and figuring out that in fact those have failed, that we have discovered that there are forces underneath those. For example, underneath the idea of rationality or madness, we have people like Foucault working to unearth the historical development of those ideas. Whether this be, again, here with representation, we're looking at the fact that, in fact, and Judith Butler especially does this, who I just recently figured out as a Deleuzean. I should have pieced that together. And a Deleuzean, at least insofar as she claims to take some of her ideas from Deleuze and is influenced by him. But she comments on, for example, the fact that the gender binary requires its postulation in order to create retroactively that binary which it presupposes. That in fact our ideal notions of, in her case, gender, are in fact things that are imposed and then retroactively create what is deemed their evidence. So in light of this, Deleuze is trying to focus on the notion of pure difference as constituting a simulacra. And this is very similar to Foucault's notion of a discourse, that things are produced as an effect in a field of difference, which is going to establish them vis their relations to other things. Deleuze says that the task of life is to make all these repetitions coexist in a space in which difference is distributed. So, right, we want to focus on difference and see how is it distributed in a given field, and figure out what he says is a hidden repetition in which a differential is disguised and displaced. That at the very fundamental core of all things is a fundamental differential which makes them what they are. It's their thisness or their hexaity, to use a term that they take from Duns Scotus, as it appears in 1,000 Plateaus. But Deleuze points out that at the outset, this sort of philosophy can be dangerous if we try to get too abstract with it, if we forget that we're talking about the real world, which is really something that he's criticizing Hegel for, is that Hegel's not actually thinking about the real world anymore. That he's focused on these ideal concepts which take difference as, oh, it's just something that's going to go away in our passage towards absolute spirit. Or in the case of Freud, that, oh, your deviation from the Oedipus complex, the fact that your dreams aren't manifesting Oedipus, is either an accident or in fact it's Oedipus repressing its own appearance. So Deleuze writes here, there are certainly many dangers in invoking pure differences which have become independent of the negative and liberated from the identical. The greatest danger is that of lapsing into the representations of a beautiful soul. There are only reconcilable and federative differences, far removed from bloody struggles. The beautiful soul says, we are different but not opposed. The notion of a problem, which we see linked to that of difference, also seems to nurture the sentiments of the beautiful soul. Only problems and questions matter. Nevertheless, we believe that when these problems attain their proper degree of positivity, and when difference becomes the object of a corresponding affirmation, they release a power of aggression and selection which destroys the beautiful soul by depriving it of its very identity and breaking its goodwill. So, right, Deleuze is saying here that there's a dangerous notion where we just say, oh, I'm different. And you just say something very benign. Like, that doesn't really mean anything unless we set that difference in its place, unless we see how does this difference connect to other differences, and what does that mean for what your lines of flight are, as they say in 1,000 Plateaus. So it's not merely a question of just identifying difference, but connecting this difference to not reconcilable or federative differences. That's right. That's Hegel. That's, oh, difference is reconcilable. It's in the process of sublating itself, of reconciling contradictory elements. Instead, difference is supposed to be a positive, affirmative force, which is able to see the things that are set in play, set them in play, and make us play with them. Deleuze writes, a book of philosophy should be in part a very particular species of detective novel, in part a kind of science fiction. By detective novel, we mean that concepts, with their zones of presence, should intervene to resolve local situations. They themselves change along with the problems. They have spheres of influence where, as we shall see, they operate in relation to dramas and by means of a certain cruelty. They must have a coherence among themselves, but that coherence must not come from themselves. They must receive their coherence from elsewhere. And this unity of coherence, this is going to be assemblages, especially as it appears kind of later in Deleuze's work that he does with Guattari. But this notion of difference is connected to actual zones of real situations that are going on. We're trying to actually talk about things in philosophy. Deleuze says that this is the secret of empiricism. Empiricism is by no means a reaction against concepts, nor a simple appeal to lived experience. On the contrary, it undertakes the most insane creation of concepts ever seen or heard. Empiricism is a mysticism and a mathematicism of concepts, but precisely one which treats the concept as object of an encounter, as a here and now, or rather as a errorjuan, from which emerge inexhaustibly ever new, differently distributed heres and nows. Only the empiricist could say concepts are indeed things, but things in their free and wild state beyond anthropological predicates. I make, remake, and unmake my concepts along a moving horizon, from an always decentered center, from an always displaced periphery which repeats and differentiates them. And this is critically important. That these notions of concepts, they exist in a field which is constantly undergoing change along with our methods of interaction. And as such, concepts are in a sort of floating state where it depends where they are incarnated to see how they will interact with things. What kind of becomings will they instantiate, as Deleuze and Guattari put it? So Deleuze is trying to find a way to combine a notion of theory with practice, really, where theory is connected to real-world ideas, but is able to extract from that real world the concepts which undergird them, and maintain still the unity that makes those concepts work in their particular situations. Moving into the introduction, the way Deleuze talks about difference and repetition, which really this is called repetition and difference, this introduction, which is kind of strange. The way he's talking about this is very similar to the way that him and Guattari talk about the refrain in A Thousand Plateaus, where there's a fundamental question of, for example, in the military, you have material stuff, and you also have concepts which rule over that material stuff and reins it in like a cattle herder and herds it into a box where it makes sense. You have things like duty and a national identity and a sense of exploration, morale. All of these are coming together and serving as the glue which allows for different people to articulate themselves with reference to a model in which they repeat behaviors, which creates some cohesion, and it has an exponential effect of increasing the cohesion of the military. Now, what Deleuze wants to point out is, as he says, to repeat is to behave in a certain manner, but in relation to something unique or singular, which has no equal or equivalent. So even in the context of the military, for example, when one is repeating behaviors, maybe you are behaving in a manner which is similar to other people, but you are not behaving exactly identically. And in that moment in between exactitude and inexactitude, there lies a moment in which each person is still repeating that repetitive activity in their own way. There is a fundamental, irreducible difference which defines every single repetitive act. As he says on page 2, if repetition exists, it expresses at once a singularity opposed to the general, a universality opposed to the particular, a distinctive opposed to the ordinary, an instantaneity opposed to a variation, and an eternity opposed to permanence. In every respect, repetition is a transgression. It puts law into question. It denounces its nominal or general character in favor of a more profound and more artistic reality. So even in the question of the military, undergirding all these different practices is a fundamental artistic method of taking these practices and making them one's own. Now, oftentimes, this can be done in a restrictive way in the military, in which individuality is feigned in exchange for a more collectivist kind of hive mind mentality. But fundamentally, as he says, there is an instantaneity and an eternity that makes this particular repetitious act one's own, turns it into an artistic question of repeating a model, but always with some variation, where even for the soldier, for example, in order for him to be doing the act and someone else to not be doing it, that means that it is his particular act. As he says, natural phenomena are produced in a free state where any inference is possible among the vast cycles of resemblance in this sense. Everything reacts on everything else, and everything resembles everything else, resemblance of the diverse within itself. And this is kind of a little bit of a rhizomatic thought kind of put into here. And for Deleuze, this brings in a fundamental question of, he says, humor and irony. It is by nature transgression or exception, always revealing a singularity opposed to the particulars subsumed under laws, a universal opposed to the generalities which give rise to laws. And these the singularity that is opposed to particulars subsumed under laws, this is basically not being reducible to a model. That, for example, the soldier is still fundamentally a singularity, a hexaity of thisness, which sets him apart from other people, which can undergo his own becomings. And he's in this free state in which one can put into play all sorts of practices and variations which can have varying consequences, which is a question that can be used to determine, for example, revolutionary struggles in particular historical environments. How can I effectuate some change? By putting into play some repetition, which is a transgression sometimes an acquiescence, but which still retains its own thisness, and which is still a universal, in the sense of like a style, that is opposed to generalities which make laws, that it's not reducible to a law-governed behavior. Now, Deleuze mentions Nietzsche and Kierkegaard throughout this, in which he talks about the way Nietzsche and Kierkegaard kind of go against Hegel, for example, and how they come up with new ways of understanding action and the link between thought and action, philosophy and action. And he writes here with regards to Nietzsche, the form of repetition in the eternal return is the brutal form of the immediate, that of the universal and the singular reunited, which dethrones every general law, dissolves the mediations, and annihilates the particulars subjected to the law. Just as irony and black humor are combined in Zarathustra, so there is within the law and a beyond the law united in the eternal return. And the eternal return, of course, is a concept of Nietzsche's, which is a famously esoteric concept per se. And the eternal return is not the eternal return of the same. It is not some sort of, history repeats itself identically over and over cyclically. No, that's not what he's trying to say. In fact, he's trying to say something similar to what Deleuze and Guattari say on page 20 of A Thousand Plateaus, pluralism equals monism. In the case of the eternal return, that things are always going to be becoming, undergoing change, being repeated and varied, in the sense of like theme and variations in classical music, in which the particulars aren't law-governed. They're always undergoing some new becoming as they come into conjunction with different things. But they're also bound by a certain style, a certain tendency of movement in the moment, which defines within the law per se, but also a horizon for a beyond, for a place to go. And this place to go, of course, for Nietzsche is the Übermensch. He says here on page 8, Nietzsche presents the eternal return as the immediate and when Nietzsche presents the eternal return as the immediate expression of the will to power does not at all mean to want power, but on the contrary, whatever you will, carry it to the nth power. In other words, separate out the superior form by virtue of the selective operation of thought in the eternal return, by virtue of the singularity of repetition in the eternal return itself. Here, in the superior form of everything that is, we find the immediate identity of the eternal return and the overman. And the overman, that being the Übermensch, which I think is better left untranslated, but that's just a me thing. The Übermensch is, of course, that horizon for being that stands in front, which in Nietzsche's philosophy, you'll see it in Das Spoke Zarathustra in the prologue, where man is essentially stretched across a rope over an abyss stretched between the Übermensch, in which man is a bridge and not a goal, in which the Übermensch stands as basically one's overcoming, some becoming that one can entertain, which is going to take what one has and, as Deleuze says, carry it to the nth power or raise it to the nth power, where we separate these forms which we think govern the particulars, and actually we just look at the particulars. We see what is holding them together at this particular point and don't reference it to some eternal ideal form which transcends them. He mentions that both of Kierkegaard and Nietzsche's objections to Hegel is that he does not go beyond false movement. In other words, the abstract logical movement of mediation. They want to put metaphysics in motion, in action. They want to make it act and make it carry out immediate acts. It is not enough, therefore, for them to propose a new representation of movement. Representation is already mediation. Rather, it is a question of producing within the work a movement capable of affecting the mind outside of all representation. It is a question of making movement itself a work without interposition, of substituting direct signs for immediate representations, of inventing vibrations, rotations, whirling, gravitations, dances, or leaps which directly touch the mind. So Hegel, if we go back to how we've treated his philosophy thus far, Hegel sees difference as a question of mediating between two solid forms, which are essentially static, until they run into some negation which changes them. And this is problematic because now movement or difference is essentially an abstract question of mediation. It becomes negative in its very essence. It can't become productive because, of course, the concepts that exist are what is productive. They are what exists. And for Nietzsche, difference is negation. Now, Deleuze wants to flip this on its head. Difference is affirmation. Difference is the Grund, which undergirds what makes things become. And what he's trying to get at is the revolutionary new take on philosophy by philosophers like Proust, Leibniz, Hume, Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, and particularly Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, because what they do is they start taking philosophy outside of its armchair mentality. For Nietzsche, truth and freedom are one, with the imagery of the eagle with the serpent wrapped around its neck. That truth and freedom coexist in one fell swoop together, which is what Deleuze is trying to do here in Difference and Repetition. That it's not just a question about representation. We can't reduce things to a stable form that just sits by for us, because that's not how the world works. The world goes faster than representations, and it moves in ways which aren't reducible. It vibrates, it rotates, it whirls, it dances, or it leaps. Think of Nietzsche's "I would only believe in a God who can dance." That fundamentally, the truth is a fleeting thing, a becoming, which if we try to approach it from the question of representation, which is to say a dead abstract philosophical concept, we in fact will never get to how philosophy, how reality works, because we essentially see difference as lack, when in fact difference is really the foundation for philosophy. Now, Deleuze wants instead to look at these various fields in which difference and repetition play out, and he wants to think of a theater of repetition. He writes here on page 10 that in the theater of repetition, we experience pure forces, dynamic lines in space, which act without intermediary upon the spirit and link it directly with nature and history, with a language which speaks before words, with gestures which develop before organized bodies, with masks before faces, with specters and phantoms before characters, the whole apparatus of repetition as a terrible power. So repetition, this process of subtly inventing in an artistic way with reference to kind of a style or with reference to tendencies. For example, maybe this is reading, and I repeat certain very abstract notions when I read, like the fact that I read from left to right and I go from the front of the back to the front to the back of the book. But each time I read a book, I'm reading a little bit differently. Like, reading doesn't mean anything without actually talking about what are we reading and how are we reading, in what manner are we reading, which, when we do this, links together not just, our experiences don't just become representations. This is the problem, is that Hegel thinks that if we're just smart enough and we're methodical enough, we can reduce all of the world to concepts, these representations, or representations, these concepts. That we can take the world and we can basically conglomerate it by going through all these contradictions and basically ending history. We can get to absolute spirit. But Deleuze is trying to point out, no, we've got all of this stuff which acts before we can put it into words, and in fact slips beyond words, in which, as he says when talking about Nietzsche, it's a theater of unbelief, of movement as psyches, already a theater of cruelty. Here, humor and irony are indispensable and fundamental operations of nature. It's this sort of, it's an arrogance that can only come from the armchair philosophy of someone like Hegel, for example, where you just assume that the world operates by principles which are easily cognizable, instead of realizing that there are so many ironic strategies, to use a term of Baudrillard's, that escape us. Now, this is going to play into Deleuze talking particularly about the constitution of spaces, talking about how does difference play itself out in a particular space. And he writes, space and time are themselves repetitive milieu. And real opposition is not a maximum of difference, but a minimum of repetition. A repetition reduced to two, echoing and returning on itself. A repetition which has found the means to define itself. He speaks of this as a stubbornness of the existent. That even notions of spaces are themselves a question of a process of repetition, process is being an important word there, which is constituting the space, and indeed the face. Think about the faciality plateau from 1,000 Plateaus. It's a question of an active constitution of a space in which the rules are not set in stone insofar as the future is not simply there. It has to be constructed. Deleuze writes here on page 15 that as long as we invoke absolute conceptual identity for distinct objects, we suggest a purely negative explanation, an explanation by default. And the problem here with explanation is that we're not encountering reality, we're explaining it. We are trying to, because this is how Hegel's system works, right? That you have a thing and, oh no, it's been negated. And then the negation gets sublated. So it's constantly a question of, oh, how do I explain away this difference? How do I subsume this difference? How do I get rid of it as quickly as possible and cognize and conceptualize it into a begriff, a concept? But instead, Deleuze is a little hesitant here. He thinks that this is definitely problematic. He writes on page 17, repetition is truly that which disguises itself in constituting itself, that which constitutes itself only by disguising itself. It is not underneath the mask, but is formed from one mask to the other, as though from one distinctive point to another, from one privileged instant to another, with and within the variations. The masks do not hide anything except other masks. There is no first term which is repeated, and even our childhood love for the mother repeats other adult loves with regard to other women. So, right, undergirding this notion of repetition is that it is not repressing some ideal form. He's kind of making a reference there to desire as it appears in the Oedipus complex with the love of the parent. That all the time, even the fundamental love that Freud wants to postulate as creating the Oedipus complex, that gets repeated and changed and altered throughout one's life in response to one's particular experiences, such that repetition is not merely a response to some fundamental maskless self. Repetition is not some negative strategy which is trying to cope, but it is constitutive instead. That it is within these masks and via these masks that reality actually plays itself out. By being constituted, by being layered, by being complicated, and not necessarily having to be reduced. He says, there is therefore nothing repeated which may be isolated or abstracted from the repetition in which it was formed, but in which it is also hidden. There is no bare repetition which may be abstracted or inferred from the disguise itself. The same thing is both disguising and disguised. So, right, in the question of the mask, take this as some notion of identity, like masculinity, for example. If I tell you that I identify as a man, that tells you nothing about the repetition which brought me to that identity category. And in fact, my saying that doesn't even mean that we therefore have a firm foundation for that category, merely that there was some repetition which got me to the point of being able to enunciate as such and feel that I have some grounding, some common ground with another, such that I can say that with confidence. Whereas in actuality, there is no bare repetition or bare mask in which I can say, oh yeah, I know exactly what you mean. That's the problem that Deleuze is trying to get out of the way of, is, as he says, the variations express, rather, the differential mechanisms which belong to the essence and origin of that which is repeated. So variation is our fundamental point. That there are all sorts of mechanisms which are bringing out the way we exist, which are a question of repetition that is in the moment, that is not abstractable. As he says in a funny sort of turn of phrase, I do not repeat because I repress. I repress because I repeat. I forget because I repeat. I repress because I can live certain things or certain experiences only in the mode of repetition. I am determined to repress whatever would prevent me from living them thus. In particular, the representation which mediates the lived by relating it to the form of a similar or identical object. So this is a question of Freud, really, where Freud is saying that you repeat certain actions, you do certain things, you have behaviors because you are fundamentally repressed, because there is some true self, which is of course governed by the Oedipus complex, and this is the id, the pure unconscious, and this is repressed because at the fundamental level you have the Oedipus complex, which is prevented via the incest taboo and all this other stuff. So as a result, repetition, and thus also difference, is a coping mechanism, like I mentioned before. Whereas in actuality, Deleuze wants to say that I repress, I have a notion of what repression is precisely because I repeat, because I was in an intellectual environment, for example, that brought me to think of who is this fundamental subject that I must get back to, so to speak. Now, Deleuze is going to keep some similar ways to Hegel, in a sense, in terms of it feels dialectical sometimes, in which he wants to talk about the evolution of a bodily movement, that concepts themselves are embodied in the world. Right? We get them from empirical experience. That's how we know what things are, because we have things get processed into memories, and then we can cognize, right? And he says that this is really a question of the repetition of an internal difference, which it incorporates in each of its moments and carries from one distinctive point to the other. So, what is going on here that is establishing a being is fundamentally a question of a difference internal to the subject itself, or an object, or anything that exists, which acts as a sort of grund from which it can improvise upon. It is a style which occurs by interacting with actual things empirically, and by repeating on this difference, it incorporates difference into its identity as moments, as memories, as moments in the past, in order to create an identity. So difference is the fundamental core here. He says, for in the dynamic order there is no representative concept, nor any figure represented in a pre-existing space. There is an idea and a pure dynamism which creates a corresponding space. So You can have ideas, but ideas such as duty, for example, don't just exist in a space in which these two things are divorced from one another. The development of the military happened in tandem with the notion of duty, for example, or the notion of national identities constituting how that particular military will develop, or technological advancements with regards to weapons, which is going to presuppose interacting with various different tribes. Or this is also going to require notions of work, which fundamentally are similar to duty but slightly different. So ideas, in and of themselves, are a question of a bodily movement, insofar as these ideas breathe a breath of life into material conditions. But that breath goes both ways. This is a space which constitutes itself in reference to difference as the fundamental force. And as a way to elaborate the really uniqueness, the difference within repetition itself, the fact that even sameness is difference, Deleuze writes on page 21, take the example of rhyme. It is indeed verbal repetition, but repetition which includes the difference between two words and inscribes that difference at the heart of a poetic idea, in a space which it determines. Nor does its meaning lie in marking equal intervals, but rather, as we see in a notion of strong rhyme, in putting tonal values in the service of a tonic rhythm, and constituting and contributing to the independence of tonic rhythms from arithmetic rhythms. And this is really interesting because if I say roses are red, violets are blue, I'm happy to see you, I love you, or what it's a terrible, terrible poem, but you've got blue and you that rhyme together. Now I'm repeating the same sound. Exactly the same sound. Ooh, ooh. That sound is repeated twice. But, of course, it's surrounded by different things. So that very abstract notion of a sound gets translated into meaning in the context of words, such that we can have a space which is constituted by duplication, which has difference at the very heart. Where even repetitions of things which are identical amounts to some difference, in which difference in conjunction constitutes the rhyme as a coherent idea. And he really puts this in an interesting way when he speaks about learning. He says that learning takes place not in relation between a representation and an action, reproduction of the same, but in the relation between a sign and a response, encounter with the other. And this is what he's trying to get at, that, for example, empiricism, because this is at the heart of the concept that we have, is the things we have interacted with in the world. We wouldn't have these concepts if we hadn't learned about them through empirical experience somehow, even if we didn't directly experience them. A fundamental part here is the fact that we encounter things which we have no representation for yet. I mean, this is so big. We encounter things which we have not yet even conceptualized, and in which we try to form concepts of, but which sometimes take a very long time. For example, I think of a child who encounters racism for the first time. Maybe someone was racist to a friend of theirs, and this friend is a foreign friend, and the person who's witnessing the racism, maybe they've never grown up in an environment where that's even a concept. And the first witnessing of racism takes the place of an encounter, a sign, that being racism, and a response, from the person who is witnessing that or from the person who's receiving it, which is an encounter, and one has to make a concept by actually encountering the world. And Deleuze's critique is that people like Hegel just forget that. He says that the movement of the response does not resemble that of the sign. Because for Hegel, there's a sort of strict causality going on here, where sublation, the act of taking these contradictions and synthesizing them into some new truth, is very formulaic. And when he lays it out in the Phenomenology of Spirit, it's very formulaic. But one thing that he's trying to get out of the way of, he being Deleuze here, is that the response is not necessarily a one-to-one correspondence with the sign that initiated that response. Precisely because not everyone responds to something the same way. Not every child is going to react to racism the same way. And he puts this into some concrete terms that I think really helps, in which there is a fundamental repetitive style at the core of the founding and creation and movement of our concepts. He writes here on page 23, "The movement of the swimmer does not resemble that of the wave. In particular, the movements of the swimming instructor, which we reproduce on the sand, bear no relation to the movements of the wave, which we learn to deal with only by grasping the former in practice as signs. That is why it is so difficult to say how someone learns. There is an innate or acquired practical familiarity with signs, which means that there is something amorous, but also something fatal about all education. We learn nothing from those who say, 'Do as I do.' Our only teachers are those who tell us to 'do with me,' and are able to emit signs to be developed in heterogeneity rather than propose gestures for us to reproduce. In other words, there is no ideo-motivity or only sensory motivity. When a body combines some of its own distinctive points with those of a wave, it espouses the principle of a repetition, which is no longer that of the same, but involves the other, involves difference from one wave and one gesture to another, and carries that difference through the repetitive space thereby constituted. To learn is indeed to constitute this space of an encounter with signs, in which the distinctive points renew themselves in each other, and repetition takes shape while disguising itself." And this is ultimately what Deleuze is concerned with, the creation of a style through difference as something constructive, as something positive and affirmative, which calls us to interact with the world. So I hope this has been helpful in beginning to understand Deleuze's more technical philosophical ideas. Please check out any of my other lectures that I've done on Deleuze, Guattari, Hegel, other postmodernists, German idealism, and gender theory. Leave any constructive or non-constructive criticism in the comments below, and I'll see you in another lecture.